This is Peter Helland and David Wemhoff on the show Citizens for Community Media. And the show, Community Media, corresponds with one of the themes that I'm going to try to press Dave about. And the first encyclical that came out, and maybe the most important one for some people, at Vatican II, was the document Inter Mirifica. And I think that means in English something about on social communication. Maybe you can jump in on that.
Sure, Peter. Yeah, I mean, Inter Mirifica came out in December of 1963. It was the first document that came out of the Vatican II Council, and it came out because the bishops were noticing that what was going on in the council was different from what the media, particularly the American media, was depicting. And of course, the Catholic media just followed the American media lockstep. So they came up with Inter Mirifica on social communications. If you talk to any bishops about it today, they'll give you a quizzical look. They don't know what you're talking about. But it's a very important document because in paragraphs 3 and 5, it basically says that the social communication is supposed to contain the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And the Catholics who employ it are to be under the control or under the guidance of the pastors of the church. That means the priests and the prelates. Well, when this document was being considered in November of 1963, guess what? A lot of people were upset about it. And who were the most upset people about it, do you think? Well, was it the Soviets?
No.
Do you think the Soviets were upset? No. The Americans were upset about it. And who led that charge? It was John Courtney Murray.
Your big book.
John Courtney Murray led that charge along with Daniel Liu, along with Novak, and some other people. They were just incensed. And why as a priest, as a Jesuit, would you be incensed by the church trying to control the social communications? Because their loyalty wasn't to the church. It was to the powers of the day. It was to the powerful private interests in America, which Henry Luce represented, along with C.D. Jackson and a lot of other people. And nothing's changed in 60 or so years. Nothing's changed since the beginning of the United States, because the First Amendment is the heart of the American experiment. The First Amendment, you got the religion stripped of their power, and you've got the private interest controlling the media. And if you can control the media, that means the government can't interfere with what the media says. If you got private interest controlling the media, they can say whatever they want. You talk about freedom of speech, they get freedom of speech, but you don't get freedom of speech. Okay? So that's why you see all these people now getting shut down, getting kicked off of YouTube, getting shut down from whatever platform there is out there, because those are all privately owned and controlled platforms. And freedom of speech only applies to the big, powerful media corporations and protection from the government. But the private corporations can kick you off of all their servers. And if you can't be heard, if nobody hears what you're saying, hey, enjoy your freedom.
And a little bit of background so people can understand why Americans reacted so negatively to that first encyclical. Or they didn't call it encyclical.
Well, it's not an encyclical. It's just a document.
That came out. Okay. So, I'm born in 1952, so the 50s is very real to me. And the impression that America had, that was given in America, is that we saved the world from most all the evil that was out there. And Hitler embodied most of that evil, and we had saved the world.
Vatican II came 17 years after the end of World War II. You can't forget that context. That's crucial. That's crucial to understanding what happened at Vatican II and who the winners are. And that's crucial to understanding Taylor Marshall's book called Infiltration, because he writes this book that's 224 pages long, 175 or so footnotes. It covers 200 years of church history and blames the communists, the Masons, and the homosexuals for infiltrating the church to destroy it. Well, first of all, nobody wants to destroy the church. They just want to turn it to their purposes. They want to use it for their purposes. This is what C.D. Jackson said. This is what Henry Luce said. If we can take this thing and use it for our purposes, to advance the American ideology, to advance liberalism. We can create the right environment for American domination, primarily through the way of American private capital, okay, and private industry, because they work hand in hand. So this is the value of taking over the church. Nobody wants to destroy it. They just want to take it over, which means that it's going to pronounce as its doctrines the very same doctrines that made America. And this is what Pope, who's the guy now, Francis, but Pope Francis said 3 years ago, in May of 16, he got on in an interview with a French magazine, and he said the confessional state is terrible, it doesn't work, we need to go along with, the idea of basically of liberalism. That's the way you organize societies. Well, it's complete repudiation of Catholic doctrine. But anyway, the leadership goes along with this idea. Okay, the church, the leadership goes along with that. And so nobody criticizes America. And Taylor Marshall never criticizes America in this entire work of his. But what he did is he got the bestseller designation for Amazon and other places. He wrote a bestseller. Well, how do you do that? How do you write a bestseller nowadays? You got to press hot buttons, right? Some of the hot buttons are what Dan Brown found out when he wrote the Da Vinci Code. There's a whole genre, which is that you write and you talk about conspiracies and secret societies and, intergenerational plans and all of this stuff. And that's what Marshall's writing about. You talk about the Masons, who are effectively no longer around, the communists who have ceased existing. I mean, you've got the Soviet Union fell. That was the great American battle of the Cold War, was against the Soviet Union and international communism. You don't have international communism anymore. You got communism in China, but it's a nationalism. You got communism in some other little, rinky-dink countries, but there's no push for international communism.
Can you explain, okay, I have a show called Israel, and it's all on Christian Zionism and dispensationalism and critiquing it and all its ramifications. But anybody that's in those circles knows that there was a book published about 1969 called The Great Late Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, and you would be in the drugstore, and you'd see that one book, Chariots of the Gods, would be like in 68, and all this book was just one of these books at your local drugstore.
Right. And where was that? Where was that drugstore? That was in the United States, in America, right?
Yeah,
that's where it was.
All the teenagers,
Union.
In the 60s, 50s, all the teenagers hung out at the drugstore.
And the guys who won the Second World War were the Americans. They won the Second World War. Okay, and that's really significant. That's really important, because when the victors are the guys who can imprint their thoughts around the world. And now, you always got to ask who benefits. Who benefits from the Masonic ideas? Now, at one point, the Masons were powerful, and there's no doubt that their ideas have found a lot of traction, and they were warned against. We were warned against by the popes. There's no doubt about that. We don't doubt that. But who are the beneficiaries? Who benefits from all of this? Well, you can say the Americans, yes. But what's America about? It's about really the concentration of wealth. So you're talking about the powerful private interests. You're talking about rich people. People with a lot of wealth, they benefit from this thing. That's what you're talking about.
But what do you say about the Foyerites, who you could argue were the kind of the base when the Republican Party started? It was Foyerites at the base, and they come right out and say that what we stand for is the belief that man's greatest desire and need is the accumulation of wealth. And we're going to form this community to get there.
Who does that benefit? That benefits the wealthy. If that becomes the norm of society, everybody wants to accumulate wealth. But here's the thing. Not everybody's an entrepreneur. A lot of people need jobs because they don't have that entrepreneurial spirit. They don't have those abilities. So they have to work and they have to raise their family. They got to do what they got to do. But not everybody can be a millionaire. Only a few people can get there. And you have to have special skills to get there, and they can get there. And this is where Marshall's book falls down. He talks about the communists, and he talks about Bella Dodd, and everybody knows about Bella Dodd, the Catholic who became a communist, and she was a lawyer, and she said she was kicked out of the Communist Party, and she repented in the arms of Bishop Sheen, who I think is a questionable person in history. I think there's some issues with him that need to be investigated. I don't think have been investigated, but he was a personality on TV, and he was anti-communist So of course, right away, he gets elevated in the minds of people because for that reason. But Bella Dodd said in her book School of Darkness, and that book was available to Taylor Marshall. She says, I realized that basically, the rich people were behind the Communist Party. Right. Well, what's that about? What's that about then? Who benefits from communism? When you have a system like communism that puts everything into the natural world, the rich people do. They still benefit. And what you do is you eliminate your competition and you create a straw man for the Americans to rise up and say, look, this is the best way for us to organize, and the best way to organize your society is along the lines of the First Amendment. We have no established church. And when you have no established Catholic church, then you have no established Catholic religion. When you have no established Catholic religion, you have no check on the powerful private interests. You have no check on the rich people in society. And you have no check on the government. And that's the truth. Because what the Catholic doctrine has always been, and right now I'm studying Bellarmine and working on my next book about America, the sun rises in the West, model for a new world order or a one world order. What you find out is that these guys were looking at Catholic theologians, at Catholic saints, at pronouncement of saints over the centuries, and they said, hey, guess what? Catholic doctrine is that every society has got to be led by a certain leader, right? You got to have a leader. So there's a temporal power, for the kingdoms and the empires. That's what they had at the time, the 1570s and 1580s. And then there's the papal power, and the papal power is for the souls. It's over the souls. So the Pope then is responsible for everybody's soul, so he can say and do things to protect people's souls. And the temporal power is there for the purpose of helping people realize their ultimate destination, which is salvation. So the temporal power has to work with the Pope. And the best way to do that is for the temporal power to institute, as his public policy, the doctrines of the Catholic Church. Okay? That's the best way to do it. Everybody knows that. That protects the little guy, and it protects the big guy. Okay? And it protects the church. Okay, but America came along in 1776, and it took a little bit of everything from everybody to say, well, you can all buy into this experiment, which is not true, because America was founded by Masons, and the whole idea was to get religion out of the public sphere. All religion could do was to approve what government did, but government acted in accordance with policies and principles that were not based on religion, and if you doubt that, just take a look at Jefferson's letter, but more importantly, take a look at Lawrence versus Texas that came out in 2003.
And what does that say?
They said, hey, guess what? You can't base the laws on any morality. That's based on religion. Now, there have been some amendments to, there have been some rulings lately in the last few years saying, you got to listen to religion. That's the Box case. You got to listen to religion. And then there was another Supreme Court case, and the name escapes me right now. It may have been the cake case. You can't be hostile to religion when you're in the government. But the reality is, the government in the United States is neutral to religion, which means that it's hostile to Catholicism. That's what it means.
But when you say Catholicism, it seems like all the other churches have taken the Kool-Aid of American ideology. They've all kind of sided with that.
Well, sure. And what de Tocqueville found is that all these churches came in and they said, we're going to do all this stuff, and we're going to do it to, we're going to do all this stuff. We're going to talk good about the government because it allows us to do it. Okay? And what you got to understand is America is very unique in world history, because the American system of government and of social organization. I don't say social organization because people get torqued around the idea of government. Is it a king? Is it a republic? Is it a democracy? That's really not the issue. The issue is the system of social organization. What determines what's right? Who determines what's right and who's good, and what's good? And what you got in America is you got a situation that was very unique, because it's August now. July 4th, we celebrate the founders of America. Sir Thomas Smith should be one of the founders of America, and so should Richard Hayklett. They should be founders of America. You probably don't even know who these people are. Fair enough. There's a book that came out called New World Inc. It talks about these guys. Sir Thomas Smith wrote a book in 1549. He said, England's going down the tubes economically. We better do something. We better get some markets. Hello, we better do something, because this is right after the English kings had seized all the church property. And so you had all these people who were unemployed, who lost their livelihood, went to the city, and you're starting to have unrest. And the economy was going down, and the English were being shut out of European markets. So Thomas Smith said, hey, we got to do something here. We got to go to Cathay. We got to build the economy. And then what you had over about 35, 40 years, you had various efforts by the English, to go and find this market, in Cathay. And you had Richard Hayklett, who in 1584 wrote a book, and he said, hey, guess what? In America, there's this place where we can build colonies and we can build farms and towns and stuff. And this is how you might do it. So what you had is then you had a bunch of private individuals and occasionally the crown sanction or approve groups to go to America and establish settlements and colonies there for the purpose of making money. Okay? Now, the way they made money back then, they did it through the trade, with furs and pelts and stuff like that, but they also did it through cultivating the land. And that took a lot of manpower. So that took a lot of people coming in from all over the place with all different religious beliefs, with all different ethnic and racial backgrounds, and trying to amalgamate them in this process of making money for the investors and for the crown. And so from the beginning, that's the issue you had in America. And at the same time that was going on, you had this whole debate between the King of England and the Catholic theologians about how is society supposed to be organized? How are Catholics supposed to have loyalty to the king? Because you had, with the excommunication of Elizabeth, you had this giant split between church and state. You had the Catholic Church with its requirements on the Catholics to do certain things, and then you had this secular prince or queen who didn't care about the Catholic Church. She was a heretic. She was a heretic. So the Jesuits went in after that. They tried to overthrow her. The popes approved of that. That failed. But then you had, how are the Catholics going to deal with this? How is the Catholic leadership going to deal with the Catholics living in England? How can they support the Queen, who is opposed to the church, and save their souls? And so this was the discussion. This was the fight that went on for a period of time. And it was at the time America was being founded. And so a lot of those ideas found their way into how the American colonies were run. And you had this separation of church and state because you had to accommodate a lot of different people to make money. So America's built on this idea from the beginning of making money.
Don't you think, though, the South challenged a large part of that American ideology as it developed, which it became with Lincoln and Gettysburg Address? Didn't the South challenge their notion of mechanical equality, radical equality? And, of course, the South lost.
Well, the South lost. The South had a different economic system from the North. It was one that was based, on plantations. It was based on growing things, not so much on trade. Not so much. I mean, they relied on trade, but it was not so much based on finance, except to finance their crops. But they had a different view of society than the North did, and I think that in a way, yeah, they didn't look at everybody being equal. They saw that there were inequalities.
Right. And then with the North winning, and it developed into a radical equality. The main criticism of the South to the North is that they worship money, that they were radically into the worship of mammon.
The North has always been heavily involved in finance and in trade. And the founders always knew that international trade or commerce was essential to America because you had a lot of industries that grew out of America, namely the fur industries. You had a lot of other industries to include shipping. You had fishing. You had all these industries that the founders saw, but they required finance. That required money. And so that was a totally different orientation than a largely agrarian society in the South that was there, growing its crops and trying to sell it overseas overseas. The Northern Americans were far more versatile, and they were a lot more able to adjust than the Southerners were with their huge plantations that required a lot of manpower.
But Taylor Marshall has a blind spot to the influence of the wealthy and the capitalists.
I think he totally skips over. He totally skips over the American. He mentions the Americans a few times, but it's very tangential. I mean, he talks very briefly about Cardinal Gibbons, who was a leading Americanist. I mean, there are two biographies on Gibbons. One was written in 1911, another in 1922, that detail everything he did, really to mute the church's doctrine on church and state. And you have to remember, Gibbons was living and prospering and rising through the ranks in America at the time that Leo XIII was writing his encyclicals from 1878 to 1900, writing all these encyclicals about how the state is supposed to be organized, recognize the Catholic Church. And Gibbons is doing his thing, and he's basically saying, America is the best ideal. It is the ideal. And he would go to Rome and he would say this. And he said that, America got it right, and this is how we're supposed to organize society. Well, that's pretty important. And Taylor Marshall has jumped over that. But he also, he skips over the whole American involvement when he talks about Vatican II. He says John Courtney Murray, in a passing note, helped to write the Declaration of Religious Liberty. And he wrote that for Cardinal Bay. But then he talks about Nostra Aetate and skips totally over the issue of the Jews. And, the Jews are a central part of Nostra Aetate. And the Jews are now associated largely with the Americans, especially with the current president. So, you kind of are looking at this and saying, okay, you're not touching some hot button items, but you're not giving us a full picture, but you're hitting other items, to get people excited to buy your book.
Yeah, and of course, you have to be alert. I mean, St. Paul and all throughout the New Testament, it's always about make sure you test and prove who's ever coming to you claiming to be some authority in the church. Because Paul talks about there's false teachers, there's false apostles, and they come as angels of light. They come presenting themselves as authentic. But we don't know if they're authentic until we test them and prove them. And you did some research on Taylor Marshall, and you're saying there's some red flags here.
Well, anytime you have a nonprofit organization, I think you've got a real issue. And, Taylor Marshall is writing for Sophia Institute Press. That's a nonprofit. That's part of Sophia Institute. They oversee Sophia Institute Press, and they publish his book, which publishes books. Sophia Institute Press publishes his book. And it's all 501c3. It's a nonprofit. So you have to do certain things to be a nonprofit. And what's a nonprofit in the United States? Well, it's an organization that's supposed to be for charitable purposes. So that means that you can make contributions to it that are tax deductible. And so what that means is you're always looking for a handout when you're a nonprofit. You can sell your books, your writings, whatever, make money from that. But in order to keep the organization going, you need to get contributions. Well, the idea of a nonprofit where you could provide tax-deductible contributions came about in 1918 with the Revenue Act. And it's really a brilliant act, because what happens then is you now have the wealthy, who are always looking for tax breaks, able to give money to these organizations that are supposed to be doing charitable religious things. And so you follow the money. They give a lot of money, they're going to control the message. That's kind of how it works. They get a tax break. They give a lot of money, they get a tax break, they control the message. And so the guys writing the books and the guys writing whatever they write and doing whatever they do, there's certain topics they're not going to touch. They're just not going to touch. They're not going to talk about the wealthy, who are behind a lot of this stuff, who benefit, in America. And if you've got ability and talent, you can move up in America. There's no doubt about it. But nobody wants to criticize that, and that's the problem with nonprofits. That's the problem too that the church has had. The church has taken on this nonprofit, aura, and so now they're beholden on a government agency to say you're still within the terms of the nonprofit. Well, what happened to giving to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's? And so that's been confused with the whole nonprofit. The message gets muted, and unfortunately, I think it gets controlled too.
But you can develop a to package yourself. You can present yourself in a way that's appealing to the populace. In other words, he's got this image. He's got 8 children. And he's kind of like this true Catholic.
Look, the people who got to lead are the priests and the prelates. You're the guys who need to lead. The priests need to lead, but you need to lead from a position, of the truth. You have to follow the truth, and you have to be men. You can't be effeminate. You can't be equivocal. You got to be willing to suffer and to die for the faith. And I've put forth, some rather harsh requirements that I think priests should have. I think they should do manual labor. I think that they should be required to make their own living. This toughens them up. But they're supposed to lead. They're supposed to exert influence over people, tell rich and poor alike what they're to do and what not to do. And they should influence especially the writers, especially under Inter Mirifica, paragraphs 3 and 5. They're supposed to tell the writers, the chatters, the scribblers, that's right, that's wrong. They should take control of the message. The priests and the prelates should take control of it. But they don't. They don't take control of it.
Well, how can they when they live in a system that says authority comes from the people?
Well, the only way they can do it is by suffering. They've got to repudiate that system publicly. They've got to repudiate Americanism again, once and for all, publicly, specifically, and then they have to get down to the business of governing the church and saving souls. But they're not interested in doing that. They don't want to do it. They're going to lose contributors. They're going to lose their retirement. They're going to lose their health care. Then what do you do?
But part of it, the American system tends to, in every which way, effeminize men.
Sure.
And when you become effeminized so far, you don't have the ability to lead.
Because it's about making money, and you have to make money. In order to make money, you got to please people, and you got to hit the markets right. You got to know what to say, man. You got to be #1 bestseller. You better know what to say, and you better know how to say it.
Well, it says in Timothy, there'll come a time that they won't be able to endure sound doctrine, but they'll gather around themselves teachers to suit their itching ears. So you have to be careful, why you like somebody. You may not have a good motive why you like them.
How can you know what I mean, really, this is a question we were talking about before. How can you know what anybody writes is the truth unless you investigate it? That's why you need the church leadership to say, nihil obstat, this is the truth. Imprimatur, this is the truth. You need authority to do that.
But if people have lost trust in the authority, they don't even trust the nihil obstat.
That's right. So what has to happen? There has to be a reform of the church, not like in the 1517, but there has to be a return to the faith.
Yeah, and in my mind, this really applies to all the churches as far as truth, that they've all kind of been softened and
they have.
And they've internalized American ideology at the expense of key Christian doctrines.
Yeah. Well, the whole American ideology that formed this society grew up in a time and a place. It was a reaction to what was going on at the time. And it's an ingenious system. I mean, it's a very intelligent, it's a very smart system, and it's a very effective system, and it's been adopted around the world. But I will tell you, the people at the heart of this system, you may think you know them, but believe me, they are incredibly clever and unscrupulous and determined.
Well, we're going to close on that, and if you have more time, we might try to do another section. Sure. But this is Dave Wemhoff and Peter Helland on Citizens for Community Media.